Across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. From healthcare workers to those overseeing essential services, to those of us hunkering down at home. At Polar Bears International, we are inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another.
And we're committed to doing our part to support you.
So we'll be coming to you live from our homes around the globe, offering a special Spring Tundra Connections series. Live broadcasts dedicated to learners of all ages, but especially to students who are learning at home.
Oh, hi! If you're a kid like me, go to Tundra Connections to learn all about polar bears and their favorite food, seals!
Join us each week this spring for something unique. Add Tundra Connections into the mix for your learning during COVID routine. Tune into a lighthearted live chat or enjoy a live stream over breakfast with two adorable polar bear cubs in the Netherlands.
Participate in conversations with scientists and take a deep dive into the world of polar bear research and policy. Ask your questions directly and learn from the experts.
Although we are physically distant, we can continue to find ways to be socially connected and come together with our friends, families, and communities.
We hope you'll join us to follow your curiosity and to find a little Arctic inspiration through virtual windows into the polar bear's world.
Hello and welcome to Polar Bears International Spring Tundra Connections series. We're excited to try something a little bit new today. We are going to learn how to draw or paint a polar bear with Allison McGree. Allison McGree is a Bozeman-based artist who teaches K to Gray art classes. She works with the local schools and does private lessons to small groups. Allison primarily does big sky country inspired pieces in oil and acrylic, and you will see that her stuff is filled with feeling and color. So today's event will last about 90 minutes, so grab your art supplies and settle in for this new lesson, this art lesson. If you have any questions along the way here, feel free to enter them into the chat window down below or the comments below. Or you could email us, questions@pbears.org. I'll get those questions over to Allison. Of course, these could be art-related questions, or if a polar bear question happens to crop up, we could try to answer that as well. So as always, thanks to our partner Explore.org for helping us do these broadcasts. We couldn't do these without you. And Allison, you are in Bozeman today. How are you?
I am. I'm doing well. It's snowing in Bozeman today.
Oh my gosh, that is wild. So it's not quite summer yet.
Not yet.
Perfect. Well, maybe it's good polar bear weather. I see you've got a polar bear behind you. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, PJ. All right, welcome to my studio, ladies and gentlemen. I love to paint, so I'm glad you are here to join me. A couple things before we get started that are kind of important to go over, especially during a time like this. So if you looked at the art supply list that I gave you, one of the things that maybe stood out is that it's not really specific, because I think that the most important thing for us now and always really is to create, and that process of creation is really important, which just means if you didn't have a canvas, grab a piece of cardboard, grab a mat board, grab an old canvas. I paint over my canvases all the time, so if there's something you don't like, you can paint over that with white and do another painting right on top of it. So try to think about minimizing the amount of materials you need to be as creative as you possibly can, because there are so many paintable surfaces in our worlds to paint on. So you do need a paintable surface. I have a canvas that I'm going to be using today. I like these nice thin canvases, especially during this time. I am doing a lot of free online classes, so if you do like to paint, please join me over at AllisonMcGree.com. I have a free painting class every Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, and a free painting class 6 p.m. Let's talk about that stuff later. Let's get your material set up. We have a paintable surface. We have brushes. So try to have 2 brushes in front of you. In general, a large brush and a small brush, but you can have as many brushes as you want. And if you do not have brushes, feel free to use drawing supplies or your fingers. Make it a finger painting. We can work with anything we have. The next thing you're going to need is a little palette, and you can repurpose a paper plate. You can use a piece of cardboard, or you can get an actual palette or a piece of plastic to put your paints on, but a palette just means what we put our paint on. So I've got my brushes, I've got my paintable surface, I've got my palette, and I need paint and a little cup of water. So let me talk about water. Got my little cup of water here to the side. With acrylic paint, tempera paint, we're going to use the water just to rinse out our paintbrush. So the water is not something that we're going to add to the color. We want the color with acrylic and tempera paint to be really, really rich and bright, which is why I love working with those kind of paints, because I love bright colored paintings. If you are using watercolor, it's a little bit opposite. So if you have a watercolor paint in front of you, get your paints ready by putting a couple drops of water into those watercolor paints. Okay, here we go. We are going to paint this painting here. So we have 2 little polar bears. So we have a little cub down here and a mama polar bear, right? And what we're going to do first, though, so we have this flat surface, and as a painter, your job is to make that flat surface appear to have dimension, right? So we want it to appear like a photo does, where it looks 3-dimensional, or if you get the chance to ever see a polar bear in real life, you want it to look like real life, where we have the sea ice down here is in front of this sea ice up here. These polar bears are sitting on the sea ice, but they are in front of the mountain back here, which is in front of it again. You see all the overlapping we're going to be doing, which is in front of that sky. We've got some northern lights going on in the sky, and today is the full moon, so I've got a big full moon to shout out the full moon. We are going to start with the background and slowly build up. So I want you to always think about this paintable surface in layers. So for this step, don't worry that for right now there is no polar bear yet. There is no mountain yet, and there is definitely no sea ice and water. We're going to start with those bright colors of the sunset and the distance. So we're going to grab what's called the warm color. So I'm going to have you grab a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, a little bit of pink if you have it. If you don't have pink, white and red make a pink, so you can mix that up a little bit. But all of those warm colors, a little bit of orange if you'd like, and a little bit of white. And we're going to paint this area first, let it dry, paint this area second, and then I'll slowly guide you through the layers of the painting. Now, as you do this, one of my things that I say in all of my painting classes that I think is really important is that you are an artist, right? So I want you to feel very, very much like you can change your mind, or you can add things that I'm not telling you to add. You can change colors that I'm not telling you to change. Do make sure to realize that it's going to be easier if you go over the steps. So if you haven't painted for a while, I would have to go step by step with me, but that doesn't mean you have to. I think a lot of what we do when we are creating is we make mistakes and we learn those mistakes. And I think that's a really important thing. So never ever feel like you have to do exactly as I say. This shouldn't feel like too structured of a thing. It should feel more like you being very, very creative. So let's get going with the painting part. I got to get my paints out. Remember, warm colors. I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow. Now, our steps here are going to be using the large brush first. So in general, we have the bigger areas are going to be covered more with a bigger brush. And then as we add in extra layers, our brushes get smaller and more detailed. Okay. I'm going to grab a little orange. A little pink. Remember, red and white makes pink. If you would like a little bit of that pink. I'm going to move this. Move my pink just a little closer. And white. Now, throughout this process, white is fantastic. If you ever want to make things appear a little less intense, white is really, really easy to add. If you want to go rogue, if you want to change the colors I would just make sure that you don't mix the two colors of the color wheel. So if we add all of these colors with all of the blue, green, and end up with a bunch of brown. So try to stick with your cool colors or the warm colors and let those dry before we switch. But don't worry, we're going to do this step by step. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find something that's called the horizon line. The horizon line is the line that's going to separate the sky here from the water here. So this line across, that's as straight as we can make it, is what I'm referring to as the horizon line. Now the most important thing about the horizon line in this circumstance is that we want it to be a little below the halfway point. So if you look at my canvas, and I always get my finger and my thumb, you can definitely use a ruler if you're more familiar, or that makes you feel more comfortable. But if I use my finger and my thumb, I hold that same thing, and I can give you an idea of where that middle is. And if you notice, there's the middle, but my horizon line is a little bit below. Two little lines, or two little dots below that horizon line. Go ahead and grab your yellow paint. So I'll do it with you. Let me find the middle first, just to show you. So find about the middle. I'm going to do two thumb widths below that middle. Okay? So this is the line of my horizon line, and that's the line that's the middle. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So find my middle, two thumb widths below that middle, and then make sure you lean back from that because you want those lines to be very even. You don't want it to feel like the world is tilting, right? It happens a lot with my paintings that sometimes if I don't do this at the beginning, things will look like they're slightly tilting, and then you have to do it all over at the end. So two little lines here, connect those two lines, like so. Pretty easy. So from here, I want to cover about halfway up with the warm colors before we move into those cool colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a little bit of white. I'm not rinsing out my paintbrush. I'm using a nice easy wrist, right? So my wrist is nice and loose. And I'm going to go crisscross across that canvas any direction. But we're moving that paint up with a little bit of yellow and white. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of paint. Still have not rinsed out my brush. Check out my brush. I don't have a ton of paint on that brush, right? So very limited amounts of paint on that brush. We don't want it to be dripping with paint. And I'm going to overlap. So this is called wet on wet. So I have wet paint in my hand, and the wet paint is also on the canvas. So I'm going to go wet right on top, and then I get this cool kind of blending. Leave a little bit of yellow down here, so the yellow is really nice and strong at the bottom. And you're going to start to see colors that mix together that you like. Try to pay attention to that because remember, this is your painting. So if there's a mix or a mixture that you're doing that you enjoy, just be aware of it and keep that. So if you don't want to add red, you definitely don't need to add red. But we're going to keep moving through. I have a tiny itty bitty bit of orange. And I'm going to layer that right on top. Again, wet on wet. Keeping that horizon line yellow. And if it feels like it's getting too muddy, use less paint and just let it dry. Okay, I'm going to use just a tiny hint of red. Now, red is pretty aggressive. Red and yellow makes orange, though, so it ends up being a good one to overlap just slightly. Then I'm going to bring just a little bit more yellow. And remember, I'm aiming for halfway up. So there's my horizon line. I'm going to go about halfway up with all of those bright colors. So keep going side to side. If you are working on paper or canvas, pay attention to the edges of the canvas because we want to make sure that this whole area has nice thick paint. Remember, this is the base layer of your painting, so this is not the final layer. This layer is all about getting a lot of cool color that we can build onto next. So keep working that, and I'm going to show you our next step because we get to do water, which is one of my favorite things to paint. We're going to do some water, and we are going to start to do the sky. Now, if I add blue right away into that yellow, blue and yellow is going to make a green. So we want to give it just a second to dry. And we're going to start here at the bottom so that this line, we started here, so this line should be a little bit more wet and this one should be a little bit more dry. If it is super wet though, give it a little bit of time or just start your blue a little further down. And I'm going to start so it doesn't turn green on you. All right, so the next colors we need, we still are going to use that white that you have, but we get to use all of these blues. So if you only have one blue, that's fine. Use a little bit of red because red really makes purple, so you can get a darker purple that way, mixing those two colors together. And then use some white with your blue so you can get the variety of blues that is going to be in that water. Okay, so I'm going to grab those colors. Still, there is no polar bear in your painting. We're not worried about the mountain. We're not worried about the sea ice, moon, northern lights, none of that at all yet. So just grab some blue. I'm going to take my big brush and I'm going to put it into my water glass, right? Just like that. So the paint doesn't dry. And then I'm going to grab some blues. If you have a set that has a ton of different blues, you can use all of them if you want to. The more the color, the merrier. Do remember, you don't need a ton of paint though. So it's always so sad at the end of a painting if you have a ton over here that you have not used. I always try to put in another canvas with the extra paint, but try, you only need a drop of each of these colors because you can always add more. But don't paint and then sadly waste your paint. Okay, our water, the line of the water is going to go side to side. So I want you to picture in your head right now, looking at the ocean or looking at a calm lake and how we have a little swivel to it, but not anything huge. We don't want it to look like there's a huge storm. We want this to be more of a serene water scene. Okay, so back to the big brush. Rinse out that brush with water. Scrub it at the bottom of your water cup. And then grab a rag, a paper towel, something to get the water out of the brush. If you are using watercolor paint, I want you to first cover this entire area below the horizon line with water. So even before you add color, if you're using watercolor paint, if you're using acrylic, stick with me, or tempera, stick with me. But if you are using watercolor paint, this whole area below, we want it to be wet on wet, which means we want that paper to be wet as well. So feel free to start that if you are working on watercolor. And if you're with me and we are doing our acrylic paint, I'm going to start with the light blue. So I can grab white, and this is going to be hard for you to see, but I have white paint. Remember, not too much paint, just the edges of my bristles have that paint on the brush. I'm going to go right below the yellow line. Let me make sure you can see. And I'm starting to use less pressure with my brush because I want that horizon line to be really nice and straight. So I'm going across that line. Always, always, always take your time, because learning to have good craftsmanship, so taking pride in your work and making sure you do the very best job you can, is exactly what we want to be doing. So I put just a little bit of white paint here to kind of prime that surface. I know you can't see it, but I'm going to grab my light blue now. And still not much paint at all. I'm going to go right on top of that white with the blue all the way up to that horizon line. And you see how it starts to mix in that really cool kind of soft way? All right, so one of the other things that is a tool and a trick that artists use to make things look more three-dimensional, make it more appear like real life, is we use brightness of color. So because this water is further away, up towards that horizon line, and we want it to look like it's in the distance, we're going to keep it lighter at the top, and then we're going to move down to darker blues at the bottom. Now, don't worry too much about this because we will add highlights and shadows toward the end as more of our details, but just something to be aware of. So I'm going to grab dark blue here. I still don't rinse out my paintbrush, still not a ton of paint. And then I'm going to start to, here at the bottom, start to build that dark blue I'm building up that dark blue all the way across the canvas, and it's going to overlap that light blue. And do you see how my wrist is still nice and loose? My forearm isn't tight. I'm just going side to side. The paint isn't dripping off the canvas, right? Nice and light. All right, down here at the bottom, still adding in that darker blue. We're going to need a couple coats of paint with this, but we still want to work to cover the entire surface of your canvas. If you notice, I'm not going the thick way with my brush, so I still have a thicker brush stroke with these big brushes, and I have a thinner one. So I've rotated my brush to the side, and I'm using a thinner brush stroke to go across the canvas. Paying attention to the mixing and what colors I like together. I'm adding a little bit of that lighter blue now, so I'm starting to overlap that dark blue. So it's still darker here at the bottom. Or a little bit more purple if you don't have. So if you don't have that dark blue, remember red with your blue is going to make a darker shade.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba.
And we're going to cover everything up. And then I want to look at that. I want to make sure that this, remember, I want this to be the lightest part, not like it's a compartment, right? Not that it has boundaries or anything like that, but it goes from darker to light. So I'm going to grab and I am going to go right here and just lighten it up. And you can see that you use a little brush. So do you see that little white line from the thin part of my brush? Okay. I'm going to add a little bit more blue. And as this dries, we're going to add more to it. But just work on filling that area up first. If it feels like the paint is wiping away, so if acrylic paint or tempera paint is too wet, if you don't let it dry a little bit in between, it will start to wipe it like you're just cleaning off the surface with your paintbrush. So you might have to wait a little bit in between, which is why we're going to take a pause on this area and we're going to move to the top up here. I'm going to let you guys catch up because I know I usually paint a little faster than the online classes, but I'll go over all the steps we have. Those of you that are ready, you're going to use your blues again, but grab an itty bitty, like a smallest drop of black, tiny little bit. Okay. Now be careful with black. Black is a great color. I like that it's extreme and vibrant and has a lot of power in it, but it can definitely take over a lot of your painting. So we don't want to have too much black. We are going to do a little bit of an underpainting for your polar bears in a minute with black. And the reason for that is, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but polar bears have black skin. So I think it's a great way to show dimension with the polar bears and for us to remember that underneath all of that white, amazing fur is actually black skin. So I'm taking just an itty bit, small bit of black. And let's go over our steps so far. So far we have found that horizon line. Remember that horizon line needs to be as straight as we can make it, but we're going to move the small brushes here in a little bit, and that will definitely help us tighten things up. So we're still just doing big areas of color right now. So we did the horizon line. Up that horizon line, we want it to be really yellow, closest to that horizon line, and then as it goes up further from that horizon line, we're adding in our warm colors. And those warm colors are the orange, red, and pink. Always a little bit of white you can mix in with that as well. And that color, if you can see, went about half the way up between the horizon line and the top. All we want to make sure you do is you have a little gap here at the top so we can fill in the dark sky and have some contrast there. So just don't go all the way up really big, not a really big deal at all. We'll just paint the black and the blues right on top of your warm colors, which should be pretty dry at this point. Mine are very, very dry. Okay, then below that horizon line, we did the water. Our brush swiveled from thick to thin on the side of your brush. Still loose brush stroke though, and not pushing really hard with my paintbrush. Remember, if you push really hard with your paintbrush, the bristles flare out and make a really, really thick line, even though you're trying really hard. So light pressure with that paintbrush, lighter blue. So I use more white up here, and as I got further down, I got darker with the blues. They intermix, so there's not really any kind of perfect separation. We want them to blend together. And remember, we are going to be adding more layers to that. So the first part of this is just to kind of fill it up with those blues, focus on dark and light. All right, we're going to go up above here. And we're going to use the same brush strokes that we have been using. We are at this step going to be completely covering up the canvas. So top to bottom after this step is going to have paint everywhere. You're going to start at this line, right, at your the top of the sunset. I'll show you the original here in a second. And you are going to just switch the blues, right? So you're going to go right to the blue, and the top part is when we add in the black. We do want it to be a straight-ish line. So I'm going to grab your favorite blue right now, whichever one is speaking more to you. Grab that blue, and then do a line as straight as you can. You can see I'm concentrating to try to keep it a nice, solid line. I mean, you're going to have to dip again into the paint. And if you're having any drips or anything like that, use less paint. Going across, right? And there is no separation, so it might even overlap that yellow and the orange, that one colored sunset just a little bit, which is completely fine to do. And then after you get that nice line, cover this, everything to the top. Let's start with blues. And don't worry too much about what's dark and what's light. The darkest part is going to be that black at the top. But for now, just kind of play around with mixing those blues together or mixing your white and blue together. And we're covering, remember, the entire surface of your painting. All right, so one thing I want to mention as we're doing this big space is that usually, inevitably, you're going to make a mistake, which is really, really, really okay. And just remember, one of my favorite quotes is that one, everything is figure-outable, and two, an artist never makes a mistake, which just means that you change your mind. The end of that quote is an artist never makes a mistake, they just change their mind. So if there's something you don't like, don't freak out about it. Just breathe for a second, let it dry, and then use the white paint and go right over the top of it, and you can really eliminate everything. It's a little bit more difficult if you have watercolor, but some things I do with my own work, if I do a drawing of something and I don't like it, or if I did a landscape and I turn away from it and accidentally do a big brush stroke on it, turn it into a cloud, turn it into a bird, look at it, be as creative as you possibly can, and it's not ruined, it just is going to change into be something else. And 9 times out of 10, all of my mistakes, quote unquote mistakes, end up being cooler than my original thought. So think about that, always being able to change things up. And the worst part is the patience that is required when you're letting something dry. All right, so keep doing that, the full blue all the way to the top. This is one of my favorite things. Sometimes I'll just paint all the sky and all water because it's so relaxing to get a nice cloudscape going. All right, so our next thing is we want to start to add in that dark. So don't do anything yet, but we are going to begin to overlap that black paint. So the black is it going to be at the top here, and it doesn't go all the way down, right? So not all the way, your blue is not going to be completely covered over. The edges of the canvas, right? So that if you look closely, this is a better side to look at. You see how there's a little bit of black that skirts down? So it's not a straight line, it's like an umbrella that we can put stars on. So same paintbrush, same big paintbrush. Still have my blue paint on there. I have not rinsed it out. And if you missed the step, make sure you have a little bit of black on your palette. Okay. I'm going to start with a little itty bitty baby amount of black. So hardly any black at all. I'm going to start at the top, and I'm going to do one brush stroke all the way across. Now, we are painting wet on wet in this area, so your blue is probably a little bit wet, which is great because you can start to blend the black and blue together. So it won't be just solid black. Together, that's exactly what we wanted to do. Now, we don't want a straight line. So I'm going to bring my black down to the sides just a little bit, a few little dashes. Oop. Now, see, there's that little mistake, right? I have a little bit of black on the edge here, but I'm going to wipe that off with my finger. And I know that I have mountains that are going to go there in a minute, so I'm not worried about it. Okay, I'm doing a few little lines, leaving some of that blue, but about half of the way down and a little further down on the sides here, that is going to be the dark. Right? So not much. That was one little drip of black paint. You really don't need a whole lot for that. Okay, for this step, keep working on the sky, and I want you to put your paintbrush into your water cup and find your small paintbrush. Because we are going to do our first overlapping. We're going to start to build up your mountains. All right, so as far as paintbrushes go, there are a million different kinds of paintbrushes, honestly. So if you get further into painting, make sure try them all out and see which one you like the best. But there are these ones that are a little rounded, right? So that's called a round tipped paintbrush. And then they have this one that's a little flat. Either works. If, like my paintbrushes are very well loved, very well used, if it feels like the bristles of the brush are kind of fanning out, dip it in your water glass and just smooth out the bristles of the brush. And that will give you a thinner brush or thinner bristles to work with. So that's a little trick. Also remember light pressure, so we don't need to push really hard with the brush, and we are going to slowly start to use smaller brushes like we are right now, but less amount of paint than we did as well at the very beginning. So our paint, the amount of paint is going to be smaller. All right, let's check it out. Still no polar bears in our imaginary painting at all. I want you just to focus on the mountains. The mountains do not go all the way across to the ice here. Our mountains are just, we want them to look like they're in the distance. They start at the horizon line, and I'll go through these lines with you. So they start, remember that horizon line, that straight line, and they build up in a little triangular fashion. Now, they do look like triangles, but we don't want them to be perfect triangles. So try not to do 3 exact shaped triangles. Try to make them one a little bigger, one a little bit smaller. Variety is very key in the visual arts, so we want to make sure we have a little bit of different sized mountains. I want you to look where the mountains start, and we're going to block out 2 little dots to make sure that we find out where they start on this side, which is slightly over in that blue area, and where they stop on that horizon line. So let's think about that horizon line dot first. Okay, so look side to side at this painting. If I split this painting in 2, I'll do my thumb to finger. So 1, 2. This is about the center of my painting, right? So this is an equal part and that is an equal part right around here. It doesn't have to be perfect, remember? Just find about the center, and I want you to do about 2 thumb width over. We're going to do this together, and you're going to do a little dot on that horizon line. So let's do it together. First, let's find the center so we can have a reference of what in the world we want to start with. So I'm looking at that horizon line, that straight line, looking at that. Then I'm going to grab a ruler if you need to, push it back from you just to make sure it's easier to find. But I have my thumb to my middle finger, thumb to my middle finger here. And I have black paint, such a small amount of black paint. I'm going to look, and a tiny itty bitty dot right there at the middle. Now, you don't really have to put that dot in. What I want us to do is just make sure we have more land across. So that from that little dot, you're going to 2 inches or about 2 thumb widths over, give yourself another dot, and then we are going to make this a black horizon line. So I'm going to take my black paint, small paintbrush, and I'm going over that same straight line, that very same straight line that I started with. I'm going all the way across. past the middle dot. And you'll notice I have to pick up and get more paint. Going past that middle dot. And really all that 2 thumb widths over is just a little bit further to that right side. Right? Oops, I think I may have painted my face. Okay, so this is the end of our horizon line with the black paint. Now we want to go up slightly to the blue. So find the midline where your warm touches the blue and go up about a pinky width. And that is a harder line, but let me do that. So I want you to overlap that blue just a little bit. Give yourself about a pinky width above the blue. And then you are going to connect this dot with this far side using triangular-ish shapes that are not symmetrical, so not perfect, not the same one. Some are big, some are little, some of you want to go on a hike on, and some of you just want to see at a distance. So this is going to be the tallest one. And I'm going to dip down. Then I'm going to go up a little bit, down. You want a nice, you see it kind of like this squiggle, bumpy line. I am trying to pay attention to the top part of this line because I want that to be nice and smooth. So I went down, up, slightly down a little bit, all the way back up, down, up again, and then all the way connecting that dot on the horizon line. And then we are going to fill that in with black paint. So let me show you the original, and I'll go over that one more time. Okay. So I went above the blue line to start my mouse. So I found where the orange and the warm colors meet the blue, and I went up just a little bit to overlap that. And then I dipped down because I want to show that warm color in the distance. So I dipped down and I went up, dipped down again, and I kept doing that up and down with variety to make sure that I have different size mountains up and down all the way to that horizon line. And remember, we wanted the horizon line to be extended just a little bit so that line is longer than halfway. And now you're just filling in with black paint. Now with the bigger areas, you can always grab a larger brush. So you can fill in these bigger areas with a larger brush if you want to. But you'll start to see which one you like more. So you might be more comfortable with the smaller brush. The bigger brush just takes up more space faster. I'm not dripping with paint though, so I don't have a ton of paint on here. Still just a very light layer of this paint. And if you are using drawing instruments today, it's a little bit different, but we can build this out in the same way. The overlapping is just a little trickier with a pencil. But I would advise if you only have a pencil, do the overlapping, sketch it out with pencil, all these lines with pencil, and then fill it in with either watercolor paint, if you have it, or crayons, marker, something like that. And remember, the more you do a painting, the more you study something. If you did a painting of a polar bear over and over and over again, you're going to get better at painting polar bears. That's just how it works. You put the time in. So if you want to learn how to do a specific painting better, just paint it over and over again. So this will be recorded, and you can do this a ton of times, and every single time you do it, you will learn something new about you and the way you paint. Okay, our next thing is going to be blocking in the sea ice. So make sure you have white paint, and make sure you have a little bit of blue as well. Remember, you don't need too much paint. I do go through a lot of white paint though. All right, so let's talk about the steps. So now we have the basics of our landscape, right? But our black paint is pretty wet, so we want to let that paint dry. Like I said, there's going to be some shadows going into these boulders to mimic that black skin that they have. But at the end of the day, they're going to end up much more white with a cool little blue outline. So we don't have to get too far down that direction. I do want you to think about the sea ice. And I want us to look because we want that overlapping to work in our favor, right? So we want the small pieces of sea ice, these little ones here, to look like they are in front of or closer to you, right? So if you swam out to these polar bears or on a boat or something like that, you would see this sea ice and be able to touch that, or you saw this sea ice and touch that, and this one is further away, just because of the way they sit on that field, right? So this one's first, I go up further, and it was next, and then this one is further away. So we're going to start with the itty bitty ones that are closer to you, because then we can overlap behind them. Okay? So what we're going to do is your bottom area should be pretty wet, or excuse me, should be pretty dry. I'm going to load these up together. And we are going to work on these little pieces of sea ice. So they are the smallest sea ice, right? We want to make sure that you're pretty small, and the bottom of the sea ice is flat. So I want you to go over below. So here's my mountains that I just did. I'm going to go below those mountains, and I'm going to do a little flat line that's short, and then a little flat line that's slightly further up, and it's twice the size. So I have one little dash here, one little dash that's longer here, but still just itty bitty dashes. Now I want you to look here. You see the sea ice looks like a bumpy triangle? Not a perfect triangle, but a bumpy triangle. So remember, whenever you're drawing or painting, you simplify everything you have into simple shapes. That will make it way easier to paint or draw. So I'm going to do the small one first, and I'm going to just go up in that dash, do a bumpy line with hardly any paint, and that little bumpy piece of sea ice. Now our next one is going to be a little bit larger, right? Because the dash is already a little bit larger. So we're same thing, little bumpy line, up like a little triangle. Voila. Second piece of sea ice. Now where these polar bears are sitting is the largest piece of sea ice. Okay? So stick with me for this step, and if you are further behind, so don't worry about the mountains right now. If you are still working on the mountains, let's block these things out together, blocking in the general shapes. All right, this bottom part of the sea ice is still straight, right? You see that the bottom part is still straight across right here. It moves up just a little bit, but don't worry about that. It's going to be straight, and it goes behind the big triangle. So you are going to go behind that big triangle. So one line across. Hopefully you can see that. And then I have to pick up my paintbrush because it's behind that triangle. It's going to go straight towards that little piece of sea ice. And then we're going to do a wiggle. So from here, so this is straight so far, right? From here, I want you to go up towards the corner of your painting. So I went up a little bit with that line, a little bit of a curve like a rainbow, and then straight again. Now this piece of the sea ice is right underneath the mountain, right? So make sure it doesn't go past that small mountain. Always nice to look at things in reference. So if the mountain ends here, I want to make sure my sea ice lives in this little area over here. Now we're going to do the top part of the sea ice, and this one's a little bit rougher. But I want you to make sure that you leave that blue area. We want to leave that blue area. We are going to pretend there are no polar bears here at all. So we're still in the layers that do not have polar bears in existence. I'm going to go here at the top. I'm going to go up and down, kind of mimicking a smaller mountain. And I'm going to go all the way across until I find the edge of the sea ice all the way below that mountain. And then I'm going to just do a little line, little rounded line to connect that sea ice. All right, go over to the right side, like so. And this, little triangle at the bottom. The only difference is this one, you see how it overlaps? It goes on top of that right one. So I'm going to use my white paint again. I'm going to go all the way to the far right side of my canvas, and this bottom dash is, so the bottom dash here is right in line with the middle part of that sea ice. So look at the middle part of your sea ice, bring that line over, and get that line to go all the way off the page, all the way off the side, and then all the triangle part goes on top of. Okay, I'm going to go over all of those steps one more time, so if you got lost anywhere, you can catch up. If you are ready to go, fill those areas in with white. So fill your sea ice in, just like you were doing a coloring book. Just fill it in with flat white paint. You'll start to notice, you can see that the blue underneath the white, which will give it a little bit more dimension, which is awesome. So we'll fill all these in, and then I'm going to go over all of those steps to make sure everybody's caught up. And then we are so close to painting our polar bears. And paying attention, as always, to the outside line of those objects, right? So making sure that the outside line is as crisp and as clean as I can make it. Now, if you're anything like me, a lot of times I'll come back to a painting later. So throughout the day or week, or if you do this again, feel free to always come back and you can kind of add things or tweak things or add or take things away. So for me, I always give myself permission to grab a painting literally off the wall. So you can see some of the paintings behind me. I'll grab them off the wall and add something if I need to. So when people ask how long a painting takes, it's really hard. You guys are going to finish a painting in 90 minutes today, but it might not be finished, which is totally fine. Sometimes paintings evolve, or like I said at the beginning, if you have something at your house that you don't like, or you could ask your mom and dad or somebody if there's a painting they're not using, paint white over the top of it and repurpose it. Just paint something else on top of it. Play with size. Painting things that are huge is really fun. But it doesn't have to be a really fancy art material. Remember, you can grab a big paper or a cardboard box and paint that. Okay, we're filling in the sea ice. I'm going to go over all those steps that we did first. So we have 4 pieces of sea ice, and we want it to look like the ones in the front are closer to you, right? So what we did is we had 2 little dashes, one small and one longer, on the left side of your canvas. From there, we did little lines that went up like a little triangle, a bumpy triangle. So it went up, but the bottom part, that's important. Make sure the bottom part of your sea ice is nice and flat, so it looks like it's actually part of kind of floating in the water there. And we're going to add some shadows to make sure that it feels like it's in there, but we just don't want, we want to make sure that line is nice and straight. So on both of those, then our second piece, or excuse me, third piece of sea ice is a little bit different. But remember, if I look at the mountains here, the sea ice is right below in that same area. So if I put those mountains down, you see sea ice down there. So don't pull that sea ice all the way across your page. We want to give some empty space over here as well. So this third piece of sea ice is flat, and it overlaps, or it goes behind, so the second piece overlaps on top of it. So my flat line went straight. I had to pick up my paintbrush, continue that line across, right? So still flat, and then it curves a little bit. So I went up with a little rounded line, then I went across again, and then remember that top line is a little bit more wiggly. So it went up and down, kind of like mountains, just a little bit, and then I connected with a curve right on this side. I made sure though, and if you lost any of that blue, you can always bring it back. We want to keep a little separation so it's sea ice, blue water, mountains. Then our last piece, our fourth piece of sea ice, goes off the page, so a little bit different. The bottom is still straight. It's higher up, right? So if I look at that third piece of sea ice and I bring my paintbrush over, I see that the bottom is right split between, right across from that sea ice. So there's the bottom. It goes up into the sunset, and it goes off the page. Easy. Triangle. Okay, so let me check. Okay, your sky should be pretty darn dry right now. So we are going to put in your full moon. Remember though, if you choose to not put in a full moon, that is completely up to you. But we are going to put in a small little full moon on the right side of your canvas because that's what the polar bears are checking out, the northern lights in this full moon. So their direction, their eyesight is from here to here. So small little full moon with white paint. So keep your same paintbrush. And this will take a couple coats of paint just because we have a darker background up here. You're going to find a little spot that you like, a small little circle, and fill that in with white paint. Now we do want to pay attention to those edges, as always, nice and crisp on the edges. I'm not using a lot of paint or pressure with my paintbrush. It's nice and light with pressure so I can have a nice line. And I know that that is not done, right? That is just the first coat, but you can see how well, speaking of whitening out things, so if there's anything you don't like, you see how well the white goes over the top of the color that we already had. Okay, let me see if this, okay, our sea ice is still a little wet. So what I want us to do is let's do some stars in the sky. Two ways to do stars in the sky. You can use the bristle of your paintbrush. Remember, you don't need a lot of paint for these steps. You can use the bristles of your paintbrush and do tiny little dots and vary the pressure. So change how, if you push hard, you get a bigger dot. If you do light, you get a smaller dot. But feel free to flip it over too in that back part of your paintbrush. If it's like that, I use this a lot for stars because it ends up being a perfect little dot. So our stars are all the way up in the sky between that blue and black area. So you can have as many stars if you want to get into constellations. You can definitely do that. But the stars are all up here, all the way across your sky. So we have filled in the sea ice with our first coat of white paint. We gave ourselves a little full moon with the first coat of white paint for that. You can see that we're going to add some yellow to that full moon, but that's not quite yet. We're letting the black paint dry and the sea ice dry while we put in some stars. So let me catch up to your stars. I like the back part of the paintbrush. It seems to have more of a nice rounded touch. But play around, see what you like. Remember, a lot of times you just have to try things out and be very okay making mistakes, especially with paint. We only have acrylic paint, so paint is a great way to try things out and see if you like them or not, because you can paint over the top of it. And keep on doing stars. Remember, if you have any questions for me, holler at me. There's that chat that you can ask. And if you have questions after this, remember, you can find me at AllisonMcGree.com. So feel free to ask me any questions, especially if you view this later or if you get stuck at any part, send me a note. Okay, so I've got the stars in the sky. First coat of the sea ice. And we're about to move into polar bears. So we are going to use black paint, as I mentioned, but we're going to block it out first with white because it is way more forgiving to block it out with white. Then we'll do a little black outline so we get that shadow that is remember the color of the skin being black. It's a great underbelly for our painting as well, and also helps us remember the color of the skin. So white paint, black paint, keep doing your stars, and let's talk about these polar bears. Remember, we want everything to be a basic shape. So we want to take something complicated and we want to think of it as a puzzle of really basic things such as triangles, circles, ovals, rectangles, and a combination of those things. So if I look at those polar bears very closely, you can see, I'll try not to tilt it. There we go. You can see that those little polar bears have a very oval body, right? And then we're going to do a little circle on top of their head. So let me show you with my I'm going to put my paintbrush down. So the bodies themselves, we've got an oval body here. So think egg shape. Oval and egg shape like this. right? And then the head of the polar bear, so if this is the oval, the big mama bear oval, for the body, we have a head that's a circle. And the reason we're wanting to do the head in two parts is because the nose is going to be a rounded triangle. So the nose pops out in a rounded triangle, right? So we're going to block it in using really super basic shapes that are going to look a little messy to start with, and that is completely fine. That's good. Remember, messy, and then at the end we tighten it up with smaller brush strokes. Now, it is easier to add thickness to your polar bear. It's a little bit more tricky to take it away. So try to think maybe skinny polar bear for a minute, and then we'll add some extra fat to that guy. All right. Let's see if I can hold them both for you so we can see them both at the same time. The polar bears have to sit on the sea ice, right? There we go. So we don't want those polar bears to be above the sea ice. We want them to be on the sea ice. So we are again overlapping on top of the sea ice. So let's start with the little guy. Grab your white paint, not a ton of it, just a little bit of paint. And I want you to look toward that end of the sea ice, or the end of your mountains, the end of the sea ice. Give yourself a little bit of sea ice gap here though, right? So we're not all the way off the edge. And then we are going to overlap the mountains and the sea ice and the water with an egg shape. So it hasn't gone above the mountains. You'll notice that this little guy is small enough to be right on top of the mountain. All right, so check this out. The next part is going to be the circle. And the circle is going to be the head. So remember, every painting is a story, right? So this story is about these two polar bears sitting on the sea ice and looking at the beautiful sky. So we want their head to be pointed in a certain direction, which is more the triangle, but it's good to take note. So if you're looking in a certain direction, your head points to that direction, right? So we're going to give yourself, or you're going to overlap that oval with a small little circle. And the circle is a little to the right. So do you see how it's not straight on that oval? It's a little to the right. Exactly where you want it to be. Now the triangle, think of it as an arrow. Right? So if you have an arrow that points at something, it's very similar to this. Point it at the full moon, but give yourself a little rounded edge. So at the top of that circle, I'm going to point my arrow at the full moon. And then I'm going to round it down just a little bit. So it looks kind of goofy. It'll help give it a little ear. So on the back side, give yourself just a little drop of paint, like a little rainbow shape, and then fill in that polar bear. Now, fill in the parts that you want to commit to on that polar bear. So if there's anything you want to change, it's easier to do so without filling it in. A nice oval body. And remember, you want that head to be connected to the body. That's why we overlap that circle to the oval, so it feels like that head's connected to the body. Now, it gets a little bit lost because we have white sea ice. So don't worry about that yet, because we're going to add just a little bit more black in a second. But let's block in the mama bear first. Now, the little one, we're back to overlapping because the little guy here is actually in front of this one. So our oval is going to be behind that little bear. So find the edge of your bear, right where your ear is and where that oval body is, and that is where you are going to have your line overlapped. So I'm going to do an oval from there up, and then their bums are at the same level. So all the way down, oval shape. But it's behind the little guy. So I make sure that little body is right in front. Okay, now this polar bear is gazing kind of down a little bit, taking a look at the cub, right? So the head shifts a little bit. The little one's looking more up to the full moon. The other one is looking a little bit further down. So we're going to go on the left side of the head here, on this side, and do a rounded circle. And on the back side of that circle, we're going to make sure that the bear is connected. So you see right here, here's our circle. Connect that line with your oval. I'll do it again. So if you got lost, don't worry. So I did an oval, remember, that goes behind the cub here. And the bottom part of it is in line. So the bums are at the same level on that sea ice, but they get lost in the white, which is fine for now. Then I did a little circle at the top for the head. And then I want to make sure that that circle for the head is connected to the body. So I did a nice rounded line here on the edge. And then I'm going to give myself a little rounded triangle that moves down. So here's my little triangle and it's moving down. Remember, pointing, this mama bear is looking at the cub. So that's why the arrow is moving down. And then we're going to fill that in with white paint. And then we'll do the black that I was talking about for our next step. So fill that whole body in with white paint. Okay, we need an ear. I forgot the ear. So the mama bear has an ear that goes up towards that high corner. So think a little bit more of a rainbow that goes up in that direction. And then I'm going to even out my lines just a little bit. You want to make sure that there's a little bump. So there's the circle, the top of the circle, the head right here, that little bump. You see it goes up and then it drops down into that triangle nose. So I go up and I want it to drop down. So we will clean up our lines in a little bit. We have the basic shapes for our polar bears. Oops. There we go. Basic shapes. And now remember, we're going to grab a little bit of black. So hardly any though. Not a ton of black at all. White on my paintbrush, so it's going to be a little bit more gray. I want to do a few committed lines with the black. And then we're going to add a few more details. Not the whole thing with black, but we'll add some more details. We're going to go back the exact way we did before. So find the body of that little bear. Use a thin brush stroke. Keep it as light as you can. And then bring it all the way around the outside of that bear, that oval shape, without going to the top. So I haven't connected at the top because now the head is on top. And here at the bottom, I'm going to put a little tail in. So a little half circle at the bottom. Very cute little tail. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the head. So the bottom part here, this line where the circle meets the nose, is overlapped on the black, but we want it to be nice and even. We want this line to be smooth all the way up. If your paintbrush is getting dried out a bit, mine's getting a little dried out, so I'm going to rinse it out with water. So I can have a smoother line. So I'm rinsing my paintbrush out with water. And then the trick I showed you, remember, taking the bristles of the brush, thinning those out just a little bit. Okay. Then I'm doing the outline. And the top of the head here, that's our little rounded line. It dips down, and we have a cute little nose. Okay. Now my black line, my little outline went up into the orange just a little bit. Let me show you what I did. As a little trick, it went right into the orange just a little bit. So I'm building up the edge of that mountain with the black that I have, just so I don't have a really big outline for the bear. Then the next part here, let's do a tiny little dot. So take a look at his ear. Hopefully you can see the ear. We're going to do a tiny little dot of black inside the ear, and a tiny little dot at the edge of the rounded line. So where that rounded line goes into the nose for the bump, do a tiny little dot there. And then we are going to do an itty bitty nose and an itty bitty smile. And the smile is just that little half line. Let me show you a little closer up what we've got going. So we're still going to add more white paint to this, but what we have here, I have outlined everything with black. I know that, remember, we still have that white to go over that dark shadow. And then I have a little eye, tiny little dot, right where that rounded kind of forehead part of the bear meets the snout, where the nose is going to be. There's a tiny little eye, and that eye is directing him to be looking at the moon. So that's where the eye is. Then we have a little half circle down here at the bottom, little smiley face. Use as light pressure as you can, because that's a small line. Another little trick is if it's too thick, let it dry, because we're going to add white paint to go over the top of a lot of the shadow. So we can add to that line to thin it down with the white paint in a minute. Then we have a tiny little dot for his nose. Remember to point it up, so the nose is at the top of that snout. Okay, so keep working on that. We're going to move into the mom, and we're going to do the same thing with the mom. Nice thin outline with our really thin brush. Light texture, or light pressure. And it could be a wet brush. So we'll start with that oval again. This one is behind that one. So I'm doing a little oval. Make sure you add that little rounded tail. And then continue outlining your polar bear. Remember that back side of the bear is nice and rounded. So connected. Then I go up to the ear, all the way down to the forehead. And we're not going to do the details yet on this guy. We're going to let that dry. Make sure you take a look. Mine looks like it's leaning, so this one got a little lean to it. So I'm going to actually take my paintbrush and move that black over a little bit. So my oval is growing. Never be afraid to change your painting. So if it's in the wrong spot, or maybe your bear just wants to lean back, you can always just leave it too. But mine here is a little bit more centered. When I was doing the demo, I kicked him back a bit. So I just extended that line a little bit to make him a little bit further. We're going to let that dry for a second. Okay. We are going to move into our yellow in the sky. So make sure that you rinse really, really well, rinse out your paintbrush with the paint, the black paint in there. So you get, I'm scrubbing my paintbrush, taking the water out of the paintbrush. Oop. And then I'm going to use my rag. So I just dabbing the water, which will help get the black out of there too. Okay, if there ends up being black in the sky in a minute, just rinse out your paintbrush and we should be good to go. So we're going to start with the moon. Grab a little bit of yellow paint and go right over the top of that moon. You can always thin it down, so I'm going to grab a little bit of white. So I have a mixture of white and yellow. Right? I'm letting these dry for a second before we move into our next steps down there. So let's talk about the Northern Lights. That's the next thing that we have here. If you choose to do the Northern Lights, it is like the ribbons of colors in the sky. Right? So what I want you to notice is that we have little lines that are all moving in this direction. The base of that line is like a little ribbon moving all towards that right side of your canvas. You can add as many or as few as you'd like to. We're going to start just with our yellow and our white paint, and then we're going to add more colors to that. So what we're going to do, so the ribbons move this way, and then our second step is to do the lines that kind of go up. So ribbons first, lines second. All right. Grabbing my yellow paint. I'm going to start over here, right at the top of that mountain, and I'm going to do just a thin little line. It should be dry. So I'm doing ribbons across the sky. All the way across. And as many, like I said, or as few as you'd like. Okay. So I've got those ribbons. Still just yellow and white paint. Now the lines are going to go up. So your lines here, look at the side of your canvas. The lines are going to go up from the ribbons. You want to go straight up and down, and not at a crisscross. So from that ribbon, I'm pulling the lines as straight as I can. Up. Some of those lines are going to be nice and long. Some are going to be smaller. But you can see all of those lines here are up, straight up and down. And still stick with just the yellow and the white for now. And we're going to add in more colors in there. Your paint is getting a really thick, a drop of water with acrylic paint will help. If you're using watercolor paint, you're going to end up using less water. So, let me get the smallest brush you have is the best one to use for this one. So just use the edge of the brush if you have a thicker one. And then little lines. And the paint is wet, so you can even pull the edge. You can even pull the edge of that ribbon up. And I'm still leaving a little bit of a gap. Some of those lines are going to be really long. They overlap all the way up to the top. So those lines are going to go into that black area. You won't see them as well. They can be in that lighter area where the sun is setting. You just won't see them as much. And you can honestly work on this for days. This could be something that you come back to over and over again. So those lines that we have, we're going to start to add a few more colors to them. So feel free to stick with the warm colors, but grab a little bit of the pink if you want to, or a little bit of orange and a little bit of red, and focus on the middle part. So this is my ribbon. Focus on the middle part here and adding a little bit of those colors, those warm pink, orange, and red. Just a few dashes. That middle part. And the lines are still straight up and down. Okay, I'm still bringing the pink. What I was talking about color combinations that you will end up liking. And one of my favorites is yellow and pink because it ends up being kind of shades of orange in between. But pay attention, like I said, whatever color combinations you like should be on your painting. Okay. The next part is we are definitely going to move into the other side of the color wheel. So we have the warm colors that we've started here, but we're going to move into a few extra as well as the edges. So everything towards the edges of your canvas. If you notice, there's a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, and a little bit of purple. The same exact brush stroke going up and down. I find it easier to pull because especially from that ribbon, I can dip into maybe a little bit of wet paint, and I can use that paintbrush to pull it up. So the paintbrush where it starts a little thicker, and as it goes up, it gets a little thinner. Okay. So I'm grabbing just a little bit of teal, and still going to press out my paintbrush. And you can see, like I said at the beginning, you use less paint. So, this one is just a few little drops of color. Always remind yourself to look away from your painting, as in step away from your painting. Look at it from a distance. Walk to the other side of the room. Take a little break. It'll help you see things more clearly. A lot of times we get really focused on something, and sometimes that makes us really frustrated. So giving your eyes a break will help. Okay, I'm going to put a little purple on my palette. If you don't have purple, remember red and blue make purple. And remember itty bitty amounts of paint. So I'm going to grab a little purple and a little green. I'm going to do the same thing, focusing at the top. Some dashes of color. Okay. So we'll leave it at that because that is something that you can definitely do on your own. And if it's too overwhelming, if there's way too much color, simply grab that background, so the color behind it, and fill it in a little bit more, and then you can paint over the top and fill it in again. But the background color is going to get rid of that. All right. So we're going to do a couple things. We're going to start with our next coat on our polar bear. We're going to take the black edges, right, the skin color, that black color that we outlined, and we're going to move it into another coat of white on the polar bear. Now, especially, remember my lean back polar bear. I need to definitely go over that black. So white paint. I'm going to use a small brush here, and you are going to go all the way. So you are covering up that black line, completely covering it up, all the way to the edge, and it will leave a little shadow. So you see that black edge, even if I covered it all up, it leaves a really nice black shadow. I'm going to do this all the way through the polar bear. So all the way up to the ear. And you can see I'm holding my breath almost when I'm doing this. You want to keep breathing. You want this line to be really nice and thin. So I'm still using small amounts of paint. I'm bracing my wrist against the canvas if I need to keep my paintbrush straight. And I'm taking my time as always. Covering up that nose. Right? So you can see it already starts to look better. Or less wild. All the way to the tail. Make sure you fill in that middle. Okay. And then we're going to do the little guy as well. So the little cub, I'm going to leave just an itty bitty sliver. We already go back over and do some shading with blue. wings in a minute. Make sure you cover up the head. If at this point, if the eye or the nose or something is in a place that you don't like, you can cover it up and go over it again. If that line for the little smile is too thick, do what I'm doing and just go right over the top of part of it with white. Bend down that line. Okay. So we filled in both of those polar bears. We're going to let those dry again for a minute. And we're going to do a little bit of the extra layers that are going to be on the sea ice and on the water. So make sure you have your blues ready and a little bit more white. And I'm going to throw this at you because it's nice to study, right? So the shadow part, that dark blue, is going to act as a shadow. And it is going to be in the water, but it's really specifically underneath each of those pieces of sea ice, just to ground them a little bit. So start with whatever you have that's a dark blue. I'm going to take my paintbrush and rinse it out. Because with dark, remember, I don't want white on the paintbrush. I'm going to take my dark blue paint, and I'm going to go right a few dashes, side to side. I'm going to straight brush strokes, go with the flow of that water, but side to side, right behind that sea ice. So we see a little shadow. So it's right underneath it, a few little dashes. And vary the size, so you don't make it a perfect straight shadow. It's just a few, so it's still water. This is just a darker version of the water. I'm going to go right under the sea ice here, a few extra lines. Even less paint than before. All those small pieces of sea ice, so everything has a little bit of a shadow. And you can add a few little lines over here to the side, just so it feels like it's part of the roof. A little dark down here. Remember, this, like I said at the beginning, is the darkest part, and as it gets further up, it gets much lighter. So let's talk about the white part now. So we've got the shadows down. And you're going to grab your lighter blue paint, and we're going to go right into the sea ice. Now we're going to do a few little lines to give a little rough texture, so we don't have this big flat piece of ice. We have a little rougher texture to it. As well as, let me show you this forward, as well as a rough texture of the ice, and we want to ground the polar bears, right? So you see right underneath them, we're going to put some shadows on the ice, so it feels like they are on the ice and not just in. All right, so down here, let's start on the right side. I'm going to give myself a little half circle of blue, small paintbrush still, so it looks just like a little half circle. Then I'm going to go above here, and there's going to be another little half circle with kind of a bumpy line. And then I'm going to do a little bumpy line at the top of the sea ice. So it looks like there's three little pieces. Then I'm going to mess up that line. And I can do it with my finger. So you see, not much paint at all. Or I can use it with a paintbrush and just drag that paint across the white. Same thing over here with the little guys. So three little lines, two little areas below, and then one above. And it can be messy. This one in particular, because it overlaps, make sure you get that top part of the sea ice. So outline that one in blue for sure. But three little lines, and then I just drag that paint across. So it's a little light hint of color, not full color. Okay, let's ground those polar bears, and I'll go over everything again. Okay, so look at the bottom of the polar bear. Don't go on to their white yet, but go around those polar bears with one line. Of blue paint. So you're going around the bottom of that polar bear and be kind of with the rocks though, because we don't want it to look like an outline. So I'm going to drag that color across the sea ice, side to side. I did not have any extra paint. So I just outline those polar bears and drag that paint across the sea ice. So now it feels a little bit more grounded. And throw that in there as side to side lines. So think of your moon as your light source. So the shadows are going to be on the opposite side. The moon is on this side, you're putting the shadows on the other side of those bears. Okay, we're getting really, really close. So what we did is we did 3 little lines on each of the pieces of sea ice, the small pieces, and then we scuffed it, wrapped up those lines, so it drug the paint across. Remember, if you get too much paint, just let it dry, or you can wipe it away with your hand really quickly and go back over the top of it. But we don't want sloppy amounts of paint because it's really hard to work with sloppy amounts of paint. Okay, the next thing we did is we outlined the whole bottom, just one blue line outlined the bottom of the bears all the way up to the edge of that sea ice. And then our line here pulls that paint to the side, focusing on the left side of those bears because our moon is on this side. So the light is hitting these guys, brightest part of the bear, and so we're going to put a little shadow behind them. If it got too blue, just hang out, let it dry, and add more white on top. Okay, we are going to add the details to those bears, so the eye and the nose and the mouth and things like that, and then we are good to go. So nice job so far. If at any point, remember, if you're frustrated at all in this process, it happens every single time I do a painting. So don't worry about that. A lot of times a painting is, I've been told it's like a U. So I had a professor once that said you get really excited to paint and then you start to work and things get a little bit, you know, maybe frustrating or something didn't work exactly as you want it, or you're trying to work a paintbrush or some wrong color, whatever happens dips you down. Just keep on painting, let things dry, be patient, and it will come to the other side of the U, and the other side is way cooler. It's the higher side, and you have a finished painting. So be patient with yourself. And AllisonMcGree.com, so use that as a reference to let me help you. I would love to help you. Okay. Smallest paintbrush you have, and you can always use the back side of the paintbrush for the little eye, as that is an easier way to make that little dot. So our eye on this little guy, so on the larger bear, but still where that rounded circle that we did met that triangle, we're going to go right and do a little dot, just like that. Okay, and we already had our little one, but the same thing, focus on where the rounded part of the bear meets that triangular part, and then go down a little bit to do the dot. All right, inside of the ear. So from the ear, we have a little oval shape. Like so. And then the mouth. Remember, the mouth is not a tricky line, it's just really small. So if you have a hard time with the mouth, you can do the same thing we did with the smaller bear. Let it dry and then thin out that line with white paint. Or you can use a Sharpie marker when it's dry. Either works. So the little smile here, if I follow that, let me show you both. So here's the eye. I'm going to follow that eye down. And on one side, if I imagine this is a triangle, on the far side is going to be the nose, and the other side is going to be the mouth. So if here's the end of my triangle, the point of my triangle where the eye is, let's go ahead and go right around here. So as that nose curves back, find the halfway point and do a small little smile with the lightest amount of pressure that you possibly can. Then let's do the nose. Okay, the nose is flat at the top, so it's the other side of that triangle. It's going to be flat at the top and then rounded at the bottom. Flat at the top, rounded at the bottom. Take a look at your polar bears. See if there's any lines you need to switch. So I'm going to bring the head of my polar bear down just a little bit. like so. So those little eyes. And if you switch anything up like I did, just go over the top of it as soon as it's dry. And you can move those lines around forever. Okay, last thing. If you notice, there is a little blue, just like we had on the sea ice, there's a little blue on these bears to separate them a little bit. So two things that you can do. If you have time to, you can go on your polar bear and use a ton of white and build up the texture of that polar bear. Just do small little brush strokes all the way across your polar bear using the white paint. And then the other thing is grab the teal blue. Go ahead and give yourself a little outline around that polar bear. So if you look really closely, you see that small outline. In addition, there's one thing we have this little line for the neck. So, gotta fix my polar bear, but the little line for the neck goes inside just slightly, and then all the way around. Okay, so we're working on that line, and then do a little shadow at the belly of the bear where they meet, and make sure that line goes across. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. So please make sure, I would love to see your paintings. I'm gonna bring this one up. I want to see them. So if you have Facebook, find me, tag me, Allison McGree, or grab my website and show me in one of my contact forms. So I'd love to see if you do this and if you enjoyed it. And then I'll grab the polar bear specialist and see what else we want to add in. There's a lot to be added.
I've been paying attention. I didn't have my crayons ready here, Allison, but you guys all created some beautiful art. Thanks so much for helping us out. We did have one question that came in. I didn't want to interrupt you, but we had a question that came in that said, what's your favorite type of paint? And do you ever combine paint with ink pens?
I do, yeah. No, okay, favorite type of paint is a hard one because I love oil paint as well as acrylic paint. And there are so many, the variety of paint, the types of paint are huge. There's a lot of different kinds of paint. If I am painting outside, I use mostly acrylic paint. They're easier to carry and easier to clean up. And those ones, I have a slow drying acrylic. Trying to see if I have it in here. It's a slow drying one so that the sun doesn't set it so quickly or the heat doesn't set it so quickly. If I'm using a class style, like this style of a paint, low quality paint works really, really well because it's thinner. So I use a lot of this Craft Smart paint. That's what I've been using today, Craft Smart paint. If you are in the Bozeman area though, I have these art kits. So this is a higher quality paint, meaning it's going to be a little thicker, but they work really, really well. There's not like 32 different colors of them, but they're rich in color. So those work well, and those, if you need those, and if you're in the Boston area, check out my website. There's a couple people that are helping people get art kits to them. But in the whole art world of my favorite all-time paint is oil paint. It smells great. I love the color. It feels like you're sculpting something. I have not done a lot of ink work, honestly, but I'm all for experimenting in mixed media. So I hope that people try that out too.
Yeah, maybe somebody tried that today during this little lesson. If you did, like Allison said, tag her, Allison McGree, or send your paintings, pictures of your paintings to questions@pbears.org. We'd love to see what you created today. Yeah, we'd love to share that with our community. So Allison, thank you so much for taking the time to reach out to our community and to yours today to help us paint polar bears in the Northern Lights. Your creation here is absolutely beautiful.
I love it. Thanks for having me. Thank you all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to shout out again to explore.org. Thanks so much for helping host this broadcast. And definitely visit AllisonMcGree.com for more painting instructional videos there. She does these quite often. So a great release here if you're looking for activities while during this challenging time. So thanks for everybody for joining us today. Thanks to the Polar Bears International team for helping us with all the support in the back end today as well to help make this happen. And we will be back next week talking more about polar bears Tuesday and Thursday. So please join us, and looking forward to seeing everybody next week. So have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Bye, guys.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're with you again to kick off polar bear season and our polar bear cams this week. .org, who we're working with along with Frontiers North Adventures to bring to you live polar bears right outside our window. So we have some special guests on board today we'll get to in just a moment, but we want to take a peek at what we're looking at outside there. So we have had a polar bear sleeping in that area during the day. Steve, can you see him out there? Did he move? We're going to keep an eye out for him. I know some of you got some fantastic screenshots that you've been posting. Thank you so much for that.
I can see him right now.
Looks like you might be taking a stroll, but we're going to... All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're with you again to kick off polar bear season and our polar bear cams this week. .org, who we're working with along with Frontiers North Adventures to bring to you live polar bears right outside our window. So we have some special guests on board today we'll get to in just a moment, but we want to take a peek at what we're looking at outside there. So we have had a polar bear sleeping in... All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're with you again to kick off polar bear season and our polar bear cams this week. .org, who we're working with along with Frontiers North Adventures to bring to you live polar bears right outside our window. So we have some special guests on board today we'll get to in just a moment, but we want to take a peek at what we're looking at outside there. So we have had a polar bear sleeping in that area during the day. Steve, can you see him out there? Did he move? We're going to keep an eye out for him. I know some of you got some fantastic screenshots that you've been posting. Thank you so much for that.
I can see him right now.
Looks like you might be taking a stroll, but we're going to keep our eye out. And if, oh, there he is. I think BJ's got him on the cam there. So this is on the Tundra Buggy 1 cam. So this is our mobile broadcasting studio, and we are going to drive around later once we wrap up here and go find more bears. But remember, you can always watch our other polar bear cams. So I'm with a special guest today. I'm Allison McGree with Polar Bears International, and I'm sitting with Polar Bears International's Chief Scientist, Dr. Steve Amstrup.
Hi there.
Steve, can you introduce yourself just a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I have been with Polar Bears International since 2010, and before that I was in charge of polar bear research for the U.S. Geological Survey in Alaska. So most of my on-the-ground research in Alaska, with polar bears, was in Alaska. in my
Sorry, we're just,
my
BJ's
off?
helping us with some audio here.
oh.
Yeah, this audience is used to our technical difficulties. Here we go.
So maybe I'll start over.
Sure.
So prior to joining Polar Bears International in 2010, I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska for 30 years. I was employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there I was doing work like radio collaring bears, putting ear tags on them, capturing them, weighing them, marking them, measuring them, and that sort of thing. And so over the course of 30 years, we learned a lot about movements, distribution, population dynamics, denning, and that sort of thing. And now I'm here in a very different environment with Elisa.
Thanks, Steve. So please send us your questions. You can put them in the explore.org chat box, and I believe also on Facebook, if that's where you're watching us today. We love answering questions from you guys. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the theme of today. We kind of have themes for each live chat, but really all our chats with Explore are about answering viewers' questions and knowing what you guys want to hear. But this year we did want to call attention to a celebration in Canada. It is really great research that happens with different universities and our Canadian government. And so we are going to be posting more about Canadian polar bears this year. And if you follow social media, if you can follow Polar Bears International on Facebook or Twitter, we have a fun hashtag right now called Polar Bear Proud. So if you look up hashtags Polar Bear Proud, we're going to be doing that for a whole year, and we love to hear reasons from Canadians, but also from anyone else why you are proud to have polar bears in your country or know about polar bears, or maybe you have one in your local zoo that you love and your zoo does a great job. So any reason that makes you proud that you know or have polar bears nearby, we would love to hear it. And we're going to be posting more photos online about that, so check that out. So we already have some questions coming in, so let's get right to those. And we're very lucky we have Steve as one of the world's leading experts on polar bears, so he can do most of the talking, and I can just send you the questions, Steve. So our first question is, how long do polar bears live?
Well, in the wild, polar bears can live up into their early 30s. I think the oldest bear that we had on record in our studies in Alaska lived to be 33 years old. But it's more typical for the females to live maybe into the mid-20s, maybe early 20s, and males the late teens, early 20s. Like most large mammals, male polar bears don't live as long as female polar bears, and this is partly because throughout their life, from the beginnings when they're cubs, males are starting to learn how to compete for each other, ultimately with each other, and that competition ultimately ends up being males just simply wear out a little sooner than females do.
And Churchill feels a special connection to Debbie, so that's a nice fact there. Steve?
Debbie was a star of the Winnipeg Zoo for a long, long time.
She was. And actually, her ashes are spread out here on Polar Bear Point up in Churchill. When she passed years ago, they brought her ashes up back home, so that's a really nice thing. All right, next question. Do polar bears hibernate?
Polar bears don't hibernate in the way that we normally think of them. When we talk about hibernators, there's kind of two classes of animals. There's small mammals, like ground squirrels, and they'll go into a lair or a den or a hole in the ground, and they'll drop their body temperature down almost to freezing. Polar bears don't drop their body temperatures like that, but polar bears are more advanced, and other bears for that matter, are more advanced in the way that they go into their den than some of the small mammals are. Those small mammals that drop their body temperatures so much periodically will arouse themselves during the denning or during the hibernation, and during that arousal period they'll eat a little bit, they'll drink a little bit, they'll urinate and defecate. Bears in dens, they'll go in and they might be more alert than those ground squirrels or other small mammals, but they will spend the whole winter without eating or drinking or urinating or defecating. So among scientists who study hibernation, there's kind of a debate. Are bears really hibernators or not? And, I think they are, but if you go to the small mammal definition, you might think that they aren't. But in many ways...
That's so interesting. In the kind of theme of dens, baby polar bears are born in dens. How big are they born? How big are they when they're born? And are there more than one born at a time?
polar bears, and all bears for that matter, are born very small. In the case of polar bears, a 500 or 600 pound female might have a cub that weighs only 1.5 pounds, and they're essentially hairless, they're blind, and they're totally helpless when they're born. But once they're born, they grow very rapidly because polar bear milk is really, really rich. It's almost like whipping cream. And so these cubs grow very rapidly, and by the time they emerge from the den, about 3 months after they're born, that's when they look like the baby bears that we think of, where they're, maybe 10 or 15 kilograms and looking like we typically think of as bear cubs. But those are actually 3 months old or so.
Oh, nice. They get pretty cute in those. Well, they're always cute, but even cuter after a couple months.
They're not so cute when they're first born.
No,
I'll give them that. They look kind of like drowned rats with no tails.
We've got so many great questions coming in. What is the current population in total, and then specifically in this area?
So the global population of polar bears is thought to be around 20,000, but we have to remember that that's a combination of estimates from places where we know quite a lot about bears. Like here in Hudson Bay, we know that the population here is around 800 bears in western Hudson Bay. Most of the polar bear range, we only have them and we have some idea, and add those numbers up and it's about 20,000. Was there another part to that?
And then in this specific area, how much do we know about the size of the population?
Well, the size of the population in western Hudson Bay is probably known better than any place else in the world of the polar bear. But they've been studied for a longer period here than any place else. It's a little bit easier to study polar bears in the Hudson Bay area because they come ashore every summer. Unlike in Alaska, where I studied, most of the bears spent their whole life out on the sea ice, and you always had to go offshore to find them. Here, the bears have always, at least in human terms, spent a couple of months at least on land. And when they're on land, they're a little bit easier to catch. They're a little bit easier to put radio collars on and things like that that researchers want to do. And so there's a lot known about the movements, the distribution, where these bears den. And perhaps the most important thing that we know about them is because of declining sea ice, these bears that have been studied so long have given us a record of what the impact of that declining sea ice is. And over the last 30 years, these bears are having to spend about a month longer on land than they used to. And that has resulted in less time for them to feed, more time that they're food deprived, and the population has declined from around 1,200 in the late 80s to around 800 or so now. So we know a lot about these. This population is now around 800, but has changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years.
And Steve makes an excellent point that we know so much about these bears because they do come on land at this time of year, and that's why we're able to put them their main prey, seals. It's only seals that have enough calories through their blubber to help polar bears persist and survive in the wild. So polar bears in this area are used to coming on shore in the summer when the sea ice in Hudson Bay completely melts, and then it completely refreezes in late November or December. So these bears will be leaving us hopefully shortly, but they probably have at least another month or so on land. And they're here right now because they have some maybe innate sense, whether that's light or temperature or whatnot, that they're starting to congregate towards the coast. They know that this area is one of the first areas that will see sea ice in all of Hudson Bay and within their range. And so we do start to see more bears at this time of year walking through the area. And really, they're not caring too much about us. They're not here to see us. They're here to wait for the ice. But we're here to see them, and we are safe in these tundra buggies, and the roads that we travel on are old military roads out here. So we aren't driving straight to that bear that you've seen on the cam. We're staying on the road and trying to zoom in the cam as much as we can. And then later we'll keep driving along those roads until we get to the lodge and seeing what we see along the way. All right.
I'd like to add something to what Elisa just said. So the tundra buggies that tourists ride in and the research buggy, the media buggy that we're talking to you from now, we have to stay on these trails. And so if bears were of a personality that they didn't want to be around the buggies, they wouldn't have to be. All they'd have to do is move a few yards away into the bushes and we'd never see. And we often get, and I think it's a really important one to emphasize, that it doesn't appear that there's any negative influence of these activities, these tourist activities, on the bears themselves. And I wanted to also add one other thing to when Elisa was talking about the bears here waiting for the ice to freeze up again. In about 3/4 of the world's polar bear populations live in places where historically they didn't ever come ashore, or they only came ashore rarely, including to create maternal dens. Hudson Bay and other parts of this sort of the eastern Canadian Arctic is what I called the seasonal ice ecoregion. And this is the part of the polar bear range where bears are forced ashore because the ice melts entirely. It's what we call annual ice. So there's no multi-year ice flows out there in Hudson Bay. In Alaska, where I did most of my research, there used to be lots of multi-year ice, and the bears almost never came ashore. And it's that